Welcome back to Investing Talk Podcast. Today we're getting into a company that really made some noise recently, Spero Therapeutics.
That's right. Big news.
Huge news. If you saw the headlines, you'd know about a major clinical trial success and, well, the stock price reaction that followed. It's all tied to their work fighting those really tough multi-drug resistant bacterial infections.
A critical area.
Definitely. So for this deep dive, we've gathered quite a bit financial reports, some due diligence analyses, the breaking news releases, market commentary, the whole picture.
A good stack of sources.
Our goal today is to really unpack all of this. We want to pull out the most important insights, understand what exactly drove that big catalyst, look at the financials before that happened, and figure out what this means for Spero going forward. We want you to get a good handle on it quickly.
Makes sense. And Spero Therapeutics, fundamentally, they're a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company based out in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
And their main focus.
They're zoned in on identifying and developing new treatments, mostly for rare diseases, but especially for those multi-drug resistant bacterial infections, where there's a really high unmet need.
Okay, so let's talk specifics. Before all this recent excitement, what was the main thing in their pipeline getting attention?
That would be Tibitum HBr. It's their key product candidate.
Tibitum HBr.
It's an investigational antibiotic, an oral carbapenem, and it's targeted mainly at complicated urinary tract infections, CUTIs. That includes acute pyelonephritis, which is a serious kidney infection.
And the goal there was?
The big idea, the hope, is to give patients an oral option, something that could maybe let them leave the hospital earlier or even avoid needing 5E treatment in the first place. It addresses that big gap for effective oral drugs against these resistant infections.
Got it. And the sources mentioned another candidate too, SPR720.
Yes, that was another one, SPR720. A different kind of agent targeting non-tuberculous mycobacterial pulmonary disease, NTMPD, a different kind of serious lung infection.
Okay, let's shift to the big development. May 28th, 2025. What exactly was announced?
That was the pivotal moment. Spero announced that their big Phase 3 trial for tebipenem HBr, the PIVIPO trial, was being stopped early.
Stopped early. And usually in biotech, that means good news, right?
Almost always. It was stopped early specifically for efficacy. The results were just that strong.
How did they decide that?
It came after a planned review by an independent data monitoring committee, the IDMC. They looked at interim data from quite a large number of patients, 1,690.
1,690 patients, and the results were clear enough to stop.
Exactly. The data showed the trial had already met its primary endpoint.
Which was?
It demonstrated non-inferiority. So oral tebipenem HBr was shown to be non-inferior compared to the IV standard of care, which is intravenous imipenem cilastatin. This was in hospitalized adults with these complicated UTIs or acute pyelonephritis.
Non-inferiority. Can you break that down a bit? What does that mean practically?
Sure. The primary endpoint looked at the overall response rate. That combines clinical cure, meaning the patient's symptoms got better, plus microbiological eradication, which means the bacteria were actually gone from the urine samples.
Okay.
They measure this at a specific follow-up visit, the test of cure visit. And non-inferiority means the oral drug was statistically shown to be no worse than the IV standard by more than a preset margin, in this case 10%.
So, performing comparably to the IV gold standard, but as a pill, that sounds significant.
Well, it really is. If this gets approved, tebipenem HBr could be the very first oral carbapenem antibiotic available for U.S. patients with these infections.
And why is an oral option so needed here? How big is this problem?
Oh, it's substantial. Complicated UTIs. Estimates are around 2.9 million cases a year just in the U.S. Yeah, they often lead to hospitalization, contribute massively to healthcare costs, think over $6 billion annually. And a lot of that is because current effective options often require IV administration, especially when you're dealing with drug resistance. An effective oral carbapenem could really change the treatment paradigm.
Reduce hospital stays, maybe?
Potentially, yes. Or allow for easier transition from IV to oral therapy.
Any safety issues flagged in that IDMC review?
According to the reports, no new safety concerns emerged. The most common side effects mentioned were diarrhea and headache, which seems consistent with what they'd seen before with the drug.
Okay, so strong efficacy, known safety profile. What's the immediate next step now?
The plan involves their partner, GSK. Since GSK has the commercial rights outside of Asia, they're set to take the lead.
Okay.
They intend to work with the FDA and submit a new drug application, the NDA, aiming for the second half of 2025, using this POBPO data.
Tell me more about that GSK partnership. How does that work? Spero ran the trial.
That's right. Spero conducted the PIVOT-PO trial under a sublicense from GSK. Now, with the positive data, the plan is for the formal NDA sponsorship to transfer over to GSK. They'll handle the regulatory submission and, if approved, the commercial launch outside Asia. Maybe he holds the rights in Asia.
So GSK brings the big pharma muscle for regulatory and commercial stuff.
Precisely. Their resources and experience are key at this stage.
And didn't T-Penem HBr already have some FDA designations?
It did. It received Qualified Infectious Disease Product, or QIDP, designation, and also Fast Track designation.
What do those mean?
They're part of initiatives designed to encourage new antibiotic development. QIDP, for instance, can provide things like extra market exclusivity if approved. Fast Track aims to speed up the review process for drugs addressing serious conditions with unmet needs. Both signal the FDA recognizes the potential importance of the drug.
Okay, that covers the huge news. But let's rewind a bit. Before May 28th, what did Spero's financials look like? You mentioned a Q1 report from mid-May.
Correct. They reported Q1 earnings on May 13th for the quarter ending March 31st. Total revenue came in at $5.9 million.
And how did that compare to the year before?
It was down from $9.3 million in Q1 of 2024.
Why the drop?
The main reason cited was lower grant revenue compared to the previous year. This was somewhat offset by higher collaboration revenue, specifically related to that GSK agreement.
And the bottom line? Still burning cash, I assume.
Yes, typical for a clinical stage company. They posted a net loss of $13.9 million for Q1 2025. That was a bit higher than the $12.7 million loss in Q1 2024.
For sure.
The net loss per share was $0.25 in Q1 25, compared to $0.24 in Q1 24. So still in the red, which isn't unusual at this stage.
What about their cash reserves heading into this big catalyst?
As of March 31st, they had $48.9 million in cash and cash equivalents.
And how far did they expect that to take them, their funding runway?
Their estimate was that the existing cash, plus about $23.75 million in milestone payments they expected to receive from GSK specifically earned, non-contingent payments would fund operations and capital expenditures into the second quarter of 2026.
So runway through mid-2026, factoring in expected GSK money.
That was the projection, yes.
Any interesting changes in their spending, operating expenses?
There were. R&D expenses actually decreased in Q1 25 compared to the year before, mostly because they spent less on that other program, SPR 720.
Ah, okay.
But general and administrative G&A expenses, those went up, mainly due to personnel costs and consulting fees.
And standard valuation stuff like PE ratios.
Yeah.
Probably not useful here.
Not really, no. With negative earnings, PE doesn't apply. The reports didn't detail things like debt to equity, but it's the typical financial profile of a company still focused on development, not sales.
Now, there was also a leadership change right before this big trial news dropped.
Yes, effective May 2nd, 2025. Esther Rajavalu was appointed president and CEO.
She wasn't new to the company, though.
No, she had been serving as interim president and CEO since November 2023. And she's also keeping her roles as chief financial officer and treasurer, which she also took on back in November 23.
So an internal promotion, essentially. Who did she replace?
She succeeded Sath Shukla. The announcement mentioned it was a mutual agreement for him to separate from the company.
Interesting timing, right before the major trial readout.
It certainly makes you think. Could signal a strategic focus under her leadership, really doubling down on advancing Tevapinim HBr.
You mentioned SPR 720 spending went down. What happened with that program?
Right, SPR 720, the one for NTMPD. That oral development program was actually suspended back in the fourth quarter of 2024.
Suspended? Why?
Also due to trial results, unfortunately. A planned interim look at its Phase 2A study showed it didn't meet its primary endpoint.
So a setback there.
It was, and that suspension is why the pipeline focus really narrowed on to Tevapinim HBr and why R&D spending dropped in Q1. The company did say they're still analyzing all the data from that study to see what, if anything, comes next for SPR 720.
Okay, let's put ourselves back before May 28th again. How was the market viewing Spero then? What was the general sentiment, say, among analysts?
Well, the stock had been, volatile, but trading in a bit of a range for the prior few months. It was sitting near the lower end of its recent historical range.
But maybe some anticipation building.
Definitely some upward movement just before the news, seemingly pricing in hope for these results. As for analysts, sources suggested a generally positive lean.
Like buy ratings.
Yes, one source pointed to an average buy rating from 4 analysts, and their consensus price target was around $5, which, from where the stock was trading right before the announcement, implied very significant upside, over 100%.
But not universally a buy.
No, and interestingly, one analysis we saw had a hold. The reasoning was basically, let's wait for this huge catalyst, the PIVOT-PO results, because that will really clarify the picture before making a call, which turned out to be quite prescient.
So before the good news hit, what were the main worries, the key risks investors were focused on?
The big ones were pretty standard for this kind of company. Clinical trial risk was huge, especially after the SPR 720 program was suspended. That really highlighted the risk.
Made them very dependent on tebipenem HBr.
Exactly. Huge dependence on that single lead candidate, a very binary outcome situation. Funding was also a key point. That runway into Q2 2026 relied on getting those GSK milestones, and what happened after that wasn't fully clear. And then you always have regulatory risk. Even with good data, getting FDA approval isn't guaranteed.
Makes sense. And on the flip side, what were the strengths people pointed to?
Well, the cash position, while needing future milestones, did provide runway through these immediate crucial events. The fact they were progressing a phase 3 trial in such a large, important area like complicated UTIs was a definite strength. And that partnership with GSK was seen as a major positive. It added credibility and reduced the commercialization risk significantly, at least outside Asia. The drug worked.
Which brings us back to May 28th. The news hits. Describe the market's reaction again.
It was explosive. The stock price just surged. Reports mentioned it more than doubled, maybe even tripled in very short order. A massive spike.
And what does that kind of immediate dramatic reaction tell you about how the market interpreted the news?
It tells you the market saw this as fundamentally de-risking the company and massively increasing the potential value of tebipenem HBr. Just a huge wave of optimism about their future prospects, specifically tackling that big CDTI market, especially the drug-resistant segment.
Okay, let's try to tie all these threads together now. We have a new CEO, seemingly focused. We have this absolutely critical phase 3 trial stopped early for success. We have Q1 financials showing a loss, but also a path to funding into 2026 with expected partner money. And then the stock explodes on the trial news. How does that PPO success really change the whole narrative for Spero?
It's transformative.
And
It dramatically lowers the biggest risk they face, the clinical risk tied to their main asset. That huge question mark over whether tebipenem HBr would succeed in phase 3. It's largely been answered, and answered positively.
So it clears the path towards potential approval.
It certainly smooths it considerably. Having strong phase 3 data like this is exactly what you need for an NDA filing. GSK saying they'll file in the second half of this year shows that confidence. It moves Spero much closer to potentially having a product on the market.
And that GSK partnership becomes even more central now.
Absolutely critical. Leveraging GSK's regulatory expertise, their relationship with the FDA, and their global commercial reach is vital for navigating the next steps and actually getting this drug to patients, assuming approval.
So what does this mean for Spero as a company? Is it a different kind of company now?
It could be the start of a major shift. From being purely an R&D-focused clinical stage biotech, they now have a clear path towards potentially becoming a company with an approved product generating revenue, even if indirectly through milestones and royalties via the partnership initially.
Let's revisit those risks we talked about from before the news. How do they look now? Clinical failure risk,
Massively reduced for their lead asset. That's the big one.
regulatory risk.
Still exists, of course. FDA review is never a certainty. But having phase 3 data this strong definitely lowers the hurdle. The odds look much better.
Funding risk beyond Q2 2026.
That outlook improves too. Successful data triggers milestones, potential approval triggers more milestones, and commercial sales could lead to royalties. It likely opens up better future financing options if they even need them down the line. The dependency risk on one asset is still there, but the asset looks much stronger now.
Okay, so boiling it all down from the sources we looked at, what are the absolute must-know takeaways for our listeners trying to understand Spero Therapeutics right now?
I'd say point 1. Spero hit a major home run with its lead drug, tebipenem HBr. Stopping a phase 3 trial early for efficacy is a big deal. Point 2. This drug, if approved, could be the first oral carbapenem in the U.S., filling a significant need for treating complicated UTIs, especially resistant ones. Point 3. They have relatively new leadership at the top with Esther Rajavelu. And point 4. While Q1 showed a loss, their cash, boosted by expected GSK payments, gives them runway into Q2 2026 to get through this key regulatory period.
So what should you, our listener, keep an eye on next?
Definitely watch for news on that NDA filing by GSK expected in the second half of 2025. Look out for the full data from the PIVO-PO trial when it's presented or published. The details will be important. And then monitor updates on the FDA review process and how those commercialization plans with GSK shape up. It's also a reminder of just how vital new antibiotics are in this ongoing battle against resistance.
Absolutely. And that leads to a final thought for you to consider. Given this significant clinical win, what are the next hurdles? What are the biggest challenges, but also opportunities in actually getting a drug like oral tebipenem HBr from an FDA submission through approval and into widespread use by doctors and patients, especially in a healthcare system worried about resistance and costs? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Spero Therapeutics. If you found this helpful, please do subscribe to the podcast, give us a like, and maybe drop a comment with your own thoughts or questions. We always appreciate you tuning in.